Liberia. The Liberian stream was full of energy, full of love and support for our young King IShowSpeed as he closes his tour in Namibia today. What a beautiful African tour, beautiful insight and exposure to the continent of Africa and the different countries. It was very insightful and educational, and really grateful and thankful of his experiences. Hopefully, one day my wife and I will trek along the continent as well. Liberia. Liberia occupies a rare and uncomfortable space in world history. As much as he could, he tried to explore. I mean, that stream was just like, it's like, your heart is pounding. There's so much going on, being blocked in, and just crowds crowding around, and just, it was a lot of energy. That Liberian energy hits different. So Liberia occupies a rare and uncomfortable space in world history, one that forces Americans to confront contradictions that were never taught to be examined. It is a nation born from freedom and coercion, self-determination and displacement, liberation and hierarchy. Diving into Liberian history, I learned a lot of information and facts that I was not privy to, that I thought was very interesting. Its existence raises questions that still echo today. What happens when freedom is exported through power rather than mutual belonging? And how does a people carry both the trauma of enslavement and the burden of becoming gatekeepers over others? Often reduced to a footnote in African or American history, Liberia instead sits at the crossroads of the transatlantic slave trade, U.S. political ambition, Black intellectual resistance, and global capitalism. Its story exposes how deeply American economic interests, racial ideologies, and foreign policy were embedded in Africa long before modern globalization. To understand Liberia is to understand how the past never truly leaves. It simply changes uniform. So, some historical facts, landmarks about Liberia to champion the brother IShowSpeed's experience. Some lessons are caught, not taught. So, I'm mindful that a lot of the information here is literal. And that's the beauty of IShowSpeed's experience, is exposing and showing the world some of the hidden landmarks and hidden histories in the African continent. One, Liberia's founding was both a Black freedom project and a U.S. political strategy. Liberia was founded in 1822 through the efforts of the American Colonization Society, an organization supported by prominent U.S. politicians, slaveholders who believed free Black Americans should not remain in the United States. While some formerly enslaved people saw Liberia as a chance for autonomy and dignity, others were coerced or pressured into leaving a country that had already exploited their labor. The result was a nation born from contradictory intentions: liberation on paper, displacement in practice. This dual origin of Liberia created long term consequences. Americo Liberians, descendants of Black American settlers, often replicated American social hierarchies and governance structures, positioning themselves above indigenous populations. And that's why the Liberia flag resembles the United States flag very closely, because of it being a product of creation of the American Colonization Society. Liberia thus became one of the earliest examples of how trauma, when unresolved, can reproduce power imbalances in even people of shared ancestry. Monrovia's name reveals Liberia's deep U.S. political imprint. Monrovia, Liberia's capital, was named after U.S. President James Monroe. Monrovia, a detail that reflects how explicitly American the nation's early political identity was. The Constitution, flag, legal system, and land ownership laws were modeled after United States, embedding American ideology directly into African soil. Liberia Liberia did not merely resemble the U.S., it was designed to extend its worldview. This alignment gave the U.S. enormous influence over Liberia's internal affairs for more than a century. Economic decisions, diplomatic positions, and even leadership transitions were often shaped by American interests, making Liberia one of the earliest examples of U.S. soft power abroad, long before the term existed. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, a historical first. Joseph Jenkins Roberts became Africa's first black president of a republic in 1848. Born in Virginia, he embodied the transatlantic bridge Liberia represented, an African nation led by a man shaped by American racial politics. His presidency symbolized black political leadership at a time when black Americans themselves were denied basic rights in the U.S. Yet Robert's leadership also illustrates complexity. While he expanded Liberia's international recognition, his administration continued policies that marginalize indigenous groups. His legacy forces a difficult question. Can liberation be complete if it only applies to some? Liberation and Liberia, the terms are very similar. Liberia's coast fueled the transatlantic slave economy. Before Liberia existed as a nation, its coastline, known as the Grain Coast, was deeply entangled in the transatlantic slave trade. European traders exchanged weapons, goods, and alcohol for human beings, many of whom were shipped to the Americas. The wealth generated from this trade helped finance European empires and American plantations alike. What is less discussed is the same coast later became a destination for freed Black Americans. Liberia thus holds both the memory of departure and return, enslavement and attempted restoration, making it one of the most symbolically charged regions in the African diaspora. Edward Wilmot Blyden shaped Black consciousness globally. Edward Wilmot Blyden, a Liberian intellectual and theologian, is widely regarded as one of the fathers of Pan Africanism. He argued that African identity should not be measured by European standards and that Black people possessed distinct cultural, intellectual, and spiritual contributions to humanity. Blyden's ideas directly influenced late thinkers such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, yet his name is rarely taught in American schools despite his profound role in shaping global Black political and cultural thought. Firestone Rubber tied Liberia to the U.S. industrial machine. In 1926, Firestone established one of the largest rubber plantations in the world in Liberia. This single agreement tethered Liberia's economy to U.S. industrial demand, supplying rubber for tires used in American automobiles, airplanes, and military vehicles, especially during World War II. While the plantation brought infrastructure and jobs, it also introduced labor exploitation, land seizures, and economic dependency. Liberia became an early case study in how multinational corporations could shape the fate of entire nations. So, Firestone extracts its rubber from Liberia. Liberia was never formally colonized, but not fully free. Liberia and Ethiopia are often cited as the only African nations never formally colonized by European powers. While technically true, this fact can be misleading. Liberia's sovereignty existed alongside heavy U.S. economic control, political pressure, and military influence. This reality challenges simplistic definitions of colonialism. Liberia shows that domination does not always require flags or governors. It can operate through debt, trade agreements, and partnerships that favor one side overwhelmingly. William Vakunarat Vakunarat Shadrak Tubman, sure I'm butchering this, Vakunarat Shadrak Tubman modernized the nation. President Tubman ruled Liberia for 27 years and pursued an open door policy that welcomed foreign investment. Under his leadership, Liberia experienced economic growth, infrastructure expansion, and stronger international ties, especially with the United States during the Cold War. At the same time, Tubman's rule consolidated power and limited political opposition. His era reflects the trade off many post colonial nations faced: stability and growth at the cost of democratic depth. Indigenous Liberian cultures predate the nation by centuries. Liberia is home to more than 16 indigenous ethnic groups, including the Kapela, Basa, and Vai. These societies possessed advanced governance systems, spiritual traditions, and trade networks long before settlers had even arrived. The Vai people often developed their own written script, one of the few indigenous African writing systems. Despite this, indigenous histories were marginalized under Americo Liberian rule, echoing patterns seen in settler societies worldwide. Liberia played a strategic role in World War II and U.S. security. During World War II, Liberia provided the U.S. with strategic ports, airfields, and access to rubber, resources critical to Allied success. Roberts International Airport was built to support American military logistics across the Atlantic. This alliance cemented Liberia's importance in U.S. global strategy, but also deepened its dependency. Liberia's modern history cannot be separated from Americans' military and economic ambitions. So, Liberia played a significant role in World War II, the Cold War, rubber production for Firestone in 1926, and home to 16 indigenous populations who had their own written systems and economy prior to settlers arriving. Also, home to previous enslaved Africans who were returning to Liberia, but under the pretense of a American political governing system, which in and of itself can create dissonance in the culture. So it says here, Liberia functioned as far more than a single nation state. It became an American geopolitical outpost in Africa long before the U.S. publicly framed itself as a global power. Through Liberia, the United States tested strategies that would later appear across the global South: economic leverage over territory, corporate extraction tied to diplomacy, and ideological influence without formal colonization. Neighboring regions watched closely because what happened in Liberia often previewed what was coming next. Liberia became the U.S. model for influence without formal colonization. Liberia allowed the United States to exert power in Africa without raising the political alarms associated with European colonialism. While Britain controlled Sierra Leone and France governed Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire, the U.S. positioned Liberia as independent while maintaining decisive influence over its economy, currency stability, military access, and leadership legitimacy. This model influenced how the U.S. later approached Latin America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa, favoring economic dependency, elite partnerships, and corporate contracts over direct rule. Neighboring West African leaders observed that sovereignty alone did not guarantee freedom from foreign control, reshaping how they negotiated with both the U.S. and Europe. U.S. corporate power in Liberia set the template for regional resource extraction. When Firestone secured massive rubber concessions in Liberia in 1926, it demonstrated how U.S. corporations could operate a quasi government. Firestone controlled land, labor systems, transportation routes, and export pricing, often eclipsing Liberia's own regulatory authority. Neighboring countries took note. As French and British colonies moved toward independence mid 20th century, they encountered similar corporate arrangements tied to Western interests. Liberia effectively became the proof of concept, a nation whose resources could be integrated into global supply chains while limiting local bargaining power. So some of this stuff I already kind of tapped into. So it says Liberia's Americo-Liberian elite reproduced American-style hierarchies that concentrated land ownership, political power, and education access in small ruling classes. This structure echoed throughout the region. reinforcing a pattern where Western aligned elites governed over marginalized rural and indigenous populations. Neighboring nations, even those under European rule, faced similar post independent struggles: elite dominance, uneven development, and political exclusion. Liberia demonstrated how external influence could entrench internal inequality long after formal foreign oversight faded. So, this hierarchical system translated into Liberia's economy, where even land access among Africans native to the country still were excluded due to the rule of the elite class. Liberia's heavy reliance on a narrow export base, rubber, iron, ore, timber, left it vulnerable to global market shocks. When prices dropped or contracts shifted, national stability suffered. This dependence was closely watched by nearby governments planning their own post colonial economies. As a result, some West African states attempted to diversify exports and reduce reliance on a single Western partner. Liberia became both a cautionary example and a reference point in regional economic planning discussions. Liberia's civil wars in the late 20th century destabilized the region, spilling fighters, weapons, and refugees into Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. The U.S., due to its historic ties, was drawn into peacekeeping, diplomatic mediation, and humanitarian response. This reinforced Liberia's role as a regional linchpin. When it fractured, neighboring countries felt the shockwaves. It also underscored how deeply U.S. historical involvement tied American responsibility to regional stability, even decades after Liberia's founding. So here we have Liberia's natural resources and products: natural rubber from tires, medical gloves, industrial products, iron ore, steel production and construction, timber for hardwoods, your furniture, your flooring, exporting lumber, gold, electronics, finance, and jewelry, diamonds, industrial cutting tools and jewelry, palm oil, food products, cosmetics, biofuels, bauxite, aluminum production. Okay, some historical landmarks, and then we'll close. Providence Island is where formerly enslaved Black Americans first landed in 1822. It is the symbolic birthplace of the Liberian state and represents both hope and contradiction: freedom from settlers, displacement for indigenous communities. This site mirrors Ellis Island in symbolic weight, but carries a far heavier, more moral complexity. Historically, Providence Island became the staging ground for American political systems, Christianity, and Western land ownership models in West Africa. Decisions made here shaped Liberia's governance structure for more than a century and influenced U.S. approaches to power abroad. Cape Mesurado in the peninsula, or is the peninsula where Monrovia was established. Cape Mesurado, strategically positioned along the Atlantic, it was chosen for trade access, military visibility, and political control. Its location made Liberia valuable to American and European interests alike. The Cape illustrates how geography shapes power. Control of coastal access allowed Liberia, and by extension, the United States, to influence shipping routes, regional commerce, and later military logistics during World War II. The Centennial Pavilion, built in 1947 to commemorate 100 years of Liberian independence, the Centennial Pavilion hosted presidential inaugurations, diplomatic ceremonies, and national celebrations. It symbolized Liberia's self image as a sovereign African republic with American style governance. The building also reflects elite political continuity. Many of the same families and power structures celebrated here were entrenched since the 19th century, highlighting how independence did not automatically translate into equal access to power. The Roberts International Airport, constructed by the United States during World War II, the Roberts International Airport was built primarily for American military use. It served as a strategic hub for transatlantic flights, troops, and supplies, reinforcing Liberia's importance to U.S. global security. The airport stands as a reminder that Liberia's infrastructure was often developed to serve foreign strategic needs first, an enduring pattern that influenced economic dependency and political alignment along after the war had ended. The Kadeja Cultural Center preserves indigenous Liberian traditions, art, music, and architecture. It counters the historical erasure of native ethnic groups whose cultures predate the Liberian state by centuries. This site represents resistance through preservation. While Americo Liberian culture dominated political life, Kindeja keeps alive the identities of the, I don't want to butcher this, Capel, Bassa, Vai, Crew, and other peoples whose histories are essential to understanding Liberia fully. The National Museum of Liberia. The National Museum houses artifacts from pre settlement societies, settler history, and the Civil War era. It documents Liberia's layered identity from indigenous civilizations to American influenced governance to modern conflict and recovery. The museum functions as a collective memory space in a country shaped by trauma and silence. It offers a structured narrative that helps reconcile competing histories rather than erase them. Hope you guys have a blessed day. Thank you for tuning in.